Well, welcome to our annual Monsignor James Supple Lecture in Religious Studies. Dr. Ann Clifford holds the Supple Chair of Catholic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies here at ISU. She earned her PhD at the Catholic University of America. Prior to joining the Religious Studies faculty at ISU, she held the Walter and Mary Tuohy Chair in Interreligious Studies at John Carroll University. She is a past president of the College Theology Society. In the 1990s, she served as a consultant for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Environmental Justice Program. Among her many publications are these specifically related to ecology: Foundations for an Ecological Theology of God, published in And God Saw That It Was Good; When Being Human Becomes Truly Earthly, in the Embrace of God, Feminist Approaches to Christian Anthropology; From Ecological Lament to a Sustainable Oikos, in Environmental Stewardship, a Critical Primer; and An Ecological Theology of Creaturely Kinship, Journal of Religion and Society. She is certainly eminently qualified to address her topic of Catholicism and eco-justice. In light of the approaching 40th anniversary of the first Earth Day, Dr. Clifford will address this question: does Catholicism offer any wisdom and guidance concerning responsibility to protect the environment and promote the ecological health of the planet? Please welcome Dr. Ann Clifford.
All right. Let me begin by thanking my colleague Mary Sawyer for her generous introduction. I also want to thank the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department and the administration of Iowa State University for awarding me the Monsignor James Supple Chair, and also the good people of St. Thomas Aquinas Parish across the street for keeping the memory of their beloved Father James from Ames alive by endowing and supporting the chair in Catholic Studies that I am privileged to occupy. So I will be using some PowerPoints this evening. This will not be sort of like a PowerPoint lecture, but rather a PowerPoint complement for a prepared presentation, because that way it will go a little quicker. Because you get on PowerPoint, you just go on and on. Anyway, so I chose Catholicism on eco-justice as the topic for my second Supple lecture early in the fall 2009. Actually, I had it in mind as soon as I was given the position here. I am at Iowa State University, where environmental issues and ecological sustainability really matter in very concrete ways. Also, April 22nd, 2010 does mark the 40th anniversary of the first Earth Day. And as well, in June 2009, Pope Benedict XVI addressed ecological justice in an encyclical. This was the first time any pope had done so. And also, attention back in October when I turned in the title. Climate change was in the news because of the climate change conference to be held in Copenhagen in December. So, hey, 4 things. You just can't go farther than that, other than the fact that this has been a passion of mine since the 1970s. Anyway, so I was hoping that the Copenhagen summit would be the cause for a real celebration for Earth Day, because the 105 nations that participated in the summit would strike a binding agreement that would, at the very least, compel and motivate the nations of the world to do something very concrete and specific, take real steps about climate change and global warming. Alas, the summit ended with, from my standpoint, very little accomplished by way of substantive next steps to which everybody would be committed to cut greenhouse gas emissions. James Hansen of the Columbia University Earth Institute judged the conference to be a, quotes, power failure. He argued that most of the political rhetoric by the heads of state at the conference was, quotes, greenwashing, trying to sound good while being complicit in climate system inertia. Nature, however, is not inert and is not going to wait for us. As it's spring, what can we say? Greenhouse gases grow. The world can expect extreme weather events, flooding of coastal regions, and further desertification in parts of the globe. It's very actively happening, of course, currently in both Africa and China. So a decade ago, environmental inertia was due to denial that global warming was happening. This, quotes, inconvenient truth, end quotes, is more difficult to deny today. So now many people are denying anthropogenic climate change. It's not people's faults. This is just part of regular cycles that happen in the environment due to the sun. This claim, at best a half-truth, absolves humanity from responsibility for the problem and for change. So while following the media coverage of the Copenhagen summit, words from Paul in the letter to Romans, chapter 8, kept coming to mind. All of creation is groaning. That's in verse 22 of chapter 8 of Romans. The groaning today is one of disappointment at so little resolve to address the problem of climate change that, if unchecked, will exact greater suffering on people who are already malnourished in many parts of the world, and will put many more forms of life at risk of extinction, including polar bears up north. And so creation is groaning in the struggle to bring forth and sustain life. If verse 22 of Romans chapter 8 is read in context, the reader will notice that Paul reminds his listeners that life in Christ is also life in the power of the Spirit. A person living in this power will experience true life and peace, yet life now is not without suffering. Not only humans, but all creatures await the full revelation of God with eager expectation. Until then, creation itself will undergo strife and struggle. It will groan, because creation is subject to futility, the futility of sin, and the destruction that accompany it. Even before many scientists had focused attention on Earth under a more dangerous sun, with less arable land and a far greater burden of poisonous waste, a United States senator from Wisconsin did have this on his radar. Senator Gaylord Nelson had a goal. He first spoke to President Kennedy about this goal a few months before President Kennedy was killed. He had just entered his first term as a congressman. I just find that very interesting. 1962 or 3. Okay? He wanted to promote awareness of the environment and give public recognition to a fledgling ecological movement that was growing, especially on university colleges and campuses. All right, many things converged to spark the environmental movement. Of course, one of those would be the publication of Silent Spring by the naturalist Rachel Carson. She prompted millions to see not only the effects of indiscriminate use of pesticides, but also she got people to attend to other sources of pollution that were contributing to species extinction and sickness among humans. Silent Spring prompted interest in other ecological prophets whose books had largely gone unread. Among them would be Aldo Leopold's Sand Country Almanac, published in 1949, a year after his death. This book was finally beginning to receive the attention it deserved. Leopold pointed out that ecology and economy cannot be separated. He argued that sudden species loss is inevitably due to human choices, usually for economic gain. He decried the fact that even decisions made in the name of conservation were often based simply on economic motives. Now, of the many things written and discussed leading up to Earth Day, one in particular helped to fan the embers of the environmental movement. Couldn't find a picture of Lynn White, sorry about that. Anyway, that was the historical roots of our ecological crisis, an article published in Science in 1967 by Lynn White, Jr., a UCLA historian, who specialized in the medieval period. Among the positions White argued was that Western Christianity was the major contributing factor in Earth's disastrous ecological condition. This particular article was republished in numerous collections of articles on ecology, as recently as 1995. White wrote, "In its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. Man shares in great measure God's transcendence of nature," end quote. This elevation of humans over all other human life is an anthropocentrism promoted by medieval interpretation of the biblical creation accounts. According to White, the first humans made by God were either immediately charged with subduing the earth or with naming all the animals, thus establishing human dominance. This dominance, he writes, reflects, quotes, a dualism of man and nature. I would say it would be a hierarchical dualism, but not to nitpick anyway, and has resulted in Western Christians insisting that it is God's will that humans exploit nature for their own so-called proper ends. Although White's position that Christianity is the major source for the ecological degradation of the planet strikes me to be a bit overstated, it is true that in medieval theology, humans, the creatures made in God's image, are treated as the center of the cosmic drama. They are the center of God's concern. The drama gives a lot of attention to sin, introduced by the first human pair, Adam and Eve, and to God's loving redemptive act for the salvation of humanity, the incarnation of Christ and his atoning death, often depicted very graphically. The pattern of thought resulted in Christianity's emphasis on personal salvation directed to an afterlife. White, however, signaled that he did not find Christianity inherently anti-ecology. He had drew attention to Francis of Assisi, who tried to depose man from his monarchy over creation and, quote, set up a democracy of all God's creatures, end quotes. This is the case because for Francis, the high-flying bird and the lowly ant are sister and brother to us, praising the Creator in their own ways, as brother man and sister woman do in theirs. White ended his article with a proposal. This has always surprised me after reading the first part of the article. Make Francis the patron saint for ecologists. Make Francis the patron saint of an ecological movement. Perhaps Christians, who are roughly a third of the world's population, will then commit themselves to ecological salvation and become concerned about the health of our planet here and now, and not just the afterlife. It is difficult to fault medieval Christianity for the theological emphases of that era, my humble opinion. For a largely illiterate and uneducated population equipped with only rudimentary technologies and ever vulnerable to famine and disease, life was often lived in a valley of tears, with sweetness and hope in short supply. But realistically speaking, this much smaller human population was incapable of damaging the environment on a scale that we have experienced in the past century. While personal salvation earned for humanity by the merits of Jesus Christ on the cross is strongly emphasized in the medieval period, creation was certainly not ignored. Among the biblically rooted teachings about creation worthy of note was Thomas Aquinas' insight into the sacredness of God's gift to the world in his Summa Theologiae. Here I will quote him, but not real long. Okay. We should state that the distinctiveness and plurality of things is because the first agent, who is God, intended them. For God brought things into existence so that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and reenacted through them. And because one single creature was not enough, he produced many and diverse creatures, so that what was wanting to one expression of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is single and uniform, in creatures is multiple and diverse. Hence, the whole universe shares in and represents the divine goodness. End quote. Thomas Aquinas' words echo the creation account in the first chapter of Genesis and the refrain after each day of creation. God saw it, and it was good, and poignantly draw attention to the sacredness of the whole of creation, a sacredness for which the Catholic tradition has used the term sacramentality. This term is apt for medieval creation theology, for as already illustrated, for Thomas Aquinas, creation is both the overflowing of divine goodness and God's freely chosen act of love. Therefore, not only humans, but also every creature, each in its own unique way, is revelatory of God. Although God is distinct from creation, God also sustains all creatures, giving them the gift of life. Medieval cathedrals give witness to this belief. For me, medieval Christianity is not the culprit where the health of the Earth's ecosystems is concerned. Rather, a pattern of thinking and acting traceable to the dawn of the age of science and to Francis Bacon is more culpable. A highly influential philosopher of science in the 17th century, Bacon interpreted the Genesis creation story as showing that man's control of non-human nature was not only man's responsibility, it was God's will. I purposely here am using man rather than make this a gender-inclusive statement as it unfolds. In Bacon's interpretation, he combines the two creation stories in Genesis chapter 1 through 3. Bacon interpreted blame for the first sin of Eve's willful disobedience. Eve, therefore, is responsible for the human race's loss of dominion over the earth. It's her fault. He was a philosopher in between serving as a judge of trials that specialized in curing the problem in northern England of witches. Just keep this in mind, okay? So before the fall, Adam and Eve, made in God's image, were like God, sharing in God's dominion over all earth's creatures, all of which had been given to them by God in the Garden of Paradise. With the first sin and subsequent fall from God's favor, this wonderful godly dominion was lost. Bacon envisioned science and its applications in new technologies as the only way in which man, symbolizing scientists and those with the monetary resources to sponsor scientific research, could recover the original dominion lost to him through Eve's disobedience and willful temptation of Adam. She was the one who brought us all down. Since women's inquisitiveness caused man's fall from his God-given privileged place of dominion, man's control of another female, unruly nature, should be used to regain it. It's very powerful rhetoric. You have to read it in its original instead of my sort of synopsis here. Bacon's interpretation weaves together the book of Genesis' two creation stories with 17th century British gender stereotypes and emerging idealism of scientific progress, uses the biblical text to legitimate the domination of nature by educated men like himself. His interpretation of the initial chapters of Genesis, providing thinking that contributed to the Enlightenment ideas that fed the British drive for discovery, the conquest of continents and their peoples, and the exploitation of nature in the distant lands around the globe. With its emphasis on the autonomous individual, the Enlightenment's guiding principles contributed to a structured anthropocentrism that envisioned progress in terms of the extension of the power of the educated money class. Achievement of industrial ambitions left little room for concern for the poor or for non-human life, both of which were treated as instrumental means to the achievement of specific economic goals. By today's standards of biblical scholarship, Bacon's interpretation of the Genesis creation text is fundamentally flawed. I suspect you probably figured that out anyway. But from a literary standpoint, Genesis 1, with its rhythmic cadences repeating after each divine creative act that God saw it was good and pronounced it good and so forth, this is really meant as a hymn of praise to be used in a temple, to give honor to God. As the first creation narrative progresses, on the sixth day, God creates the animals and humankind is made. And since humans do share the day of creation with animals, one might interpret this as compatible with the conclusion provided by biological evolution that humans share with all other life forms a common ancestry. In a sense, humans and animals are creaturely kin. Note how this kinship is affirmed later in the passage. God declares that every seed-bearing plant all over the earth, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, are given to humans to be their food. In similar fashion, to all the animals, birds, and every living creature that crawls on the ground is given green plants for their sustenance. Humans are not told that they may eat any of the animals. Does this affirm that humans are fundamentally connected to the animals with whom they share creation's sixth day? Perhaps. This seems to be a reasonable conclusion to me. It is a perspective from which the divine directives to fill the earth and subdue it, and to have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all living things that move on the earth can be given an ecological interpretation. If Bacon can give it his type of interpretation, I think we could turn around today and say, maybe these texts need an ecological interpretation. Subduing the earth in an agricultural economy of subsistence farming, back in the day when these texts were first written, may simply mean to clear the ground of rocks and stones and to cultivate it for food. A difficult task, especially since Israel is the land of rocky slopes and is completely dependent on somewhat unpredictable patterns of rainfall. Subduing, Hebrew word kavash, the earth, in the words of Genesis 1, verse 28, is part and parcel of the struggle for survival. Dominion in Genesis 1 has nothing to do with reigning over the earth in the sense of domination. In response to this misunderstanding of dominion as domination of nature, surely dominion entrusted to humans is modeled after a loving God who protects the defenseless and gives justice to the oppressed. A true sense of theocracy. The directive to exercise dominion may simply be a reminder to humans, do not destroy the fish, birds, and other animals. This implies that humans are to assume right relations, the core meaning of the term justice, not only with one another, but with all God's creatures. This perspective is reinforced in the second but likely much earlier account of creation. Genesis 2 provides grounds for affirming that humans and all animals share the same building blocks of life, for all are drawn from the soil of the earth. There are details of the story that are worthy of attention. In the earlier presentation of God as creator, God first forms the human out of the clay of the ground, breathes into it the breath of life, and after which God forms out of the ground, after humans this time, various animals and birds of the air. And to the human creature, God gives this directive: till the earth. Till is the same word in Hebrew for the word to serve. Serve the earth. Just love it when I find these little gems of Hebrew. God then brings the animals and entrusts the human with the responsibility of naming them. Now, Lynn White argued that naming in this text is a sign of human control over them. But in my experience, naming and knowing another's name is the way humans relate to the thing named. Another person, a plant or animal, an inanimate object, takes meaning for us when we can name it. Small children ask the question ad infinitum or nauseam, what's that? They want a name. They want to be able to relate. Naming does not change the fact that humans and the beasts and the birds are all created by God from the substance of the earth and are bound to it. Naming in this context is not a divine directive for humans to exploit animals for human ends. The second biblical account of creation is, of course, is not complete until the first human is given the life partner, Eve, who is, in fact, according to the story, the first of the pair to yield to the temptation of eating the forbidden fruit. But Francis Bacon's analogy of Eve, mother of the living and unruly mother nature, with both in need of man's control, would be laughable if it were not so tragic, if it did not drive a whole pattern of relationship to earth. It is evident that Bacon misses the mark. Of course, he had no knowledge of what biblical scholarship has on earth after his interpretation of the Genesis creation texts. His is the flourish of rhetoric to convince the 17th century readers that the investment of energy and capital in scientific research into the mysteries of God, the mystery of, he says, of God's works, was not incompatible. In fact, it was directly compatible with the book of God's words. Bring those two together. It's interesting. At one point in his writing, he calls, keep these two apart, then he brings them together. Now, we get up to our own era. Aren't you glad we moved up to it now? Okay? Maybe that introduction was too long. But this highlights for me what we mean by anthropocentrism. It's much more strong for me in Bacon than it is in medieval writings. Anyway, and in life in the Middle Ages. Anyway, Second Vatican Council. Perhaps one of the more forward-looking documents was Gaudium et Spes, the joy and the hope. The church in the modern world. Doesn't seem too exciting today, all these many years later, since it came out in 1965, but at that time, Catholicism made a very direct step away from anti-modernism to recognize itself not over against the world, but in the world. But we find in this text muted echoes of Bacon's type of reasoning. It seemed to have made their way into the Second Vatican Council's key document. One of the responses to the question, what is the human, states, and I will not make it gender inclusive here, I'll just read it as it is. Quotes, man was created in God's image and was commanded to conquer the earth with all it contains and to rule the world in justice and holiness. He was to acknowledge God as maker of all things and relate himself and the totality of creation to him, so that through the dominion of all things by man, the name of God would be majestic in all the earth. Now, it just so happens some people would just like to stop at that little part that says, man has created in God's image and was commanded to conquer the earth and all it contains. Okay? It's a good place to put a period. Many of these paragraphs are really long. That's paragraph 34 if you want to look it up. This statement is far more benign and without the blatant sexism of Bacon, but does interpret the exercise of dominion as a command to conquer the earth with all it contains. So people wonder, why wasn't the church, the Catholic Church, on top of this ecological question sooner? And some of it has to do with this kind of rhetoric. Yet a few paragraphs later, the church in the modern world, this is paragraph 36, calls for respect for nature, stating, by the very nature of creation. Material being is endowed with its own stability, truth, and excellence, and its own order and laws. And these humans must respect as we recognize the methods proper to every science and technique. Now, these words wisely soften the anthropocentrism of the earlier statement. It also demonstrates that many of these Vatican II documents were the product of committees. There's not necessarily a single coherent voice in all of them. Anyway, they also help to pave the way for attention to eco-justice in Catholic social teaching. Justice, of course, means right relations, as I already mentioned, rendering to another what is their due. And following the Second Vatican Council, justice founded on respect for creation was given attention first by the American bishops, and then later by two more recent popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So I look upon this as the dawn of a new day. Catholicism on eco-justice after the first Earth Day. 5 years exactly after the first Earth Day. So, since the Second Vatican Council, bishops in the United States from Massachusetts to Seattle, sometimes joining with Canadians, for example, have issued at least 7 pastoral letters in which the environment or ecology is substantively addressed, not just a sentence or two, but like the whole document is about that, okay? I look upon this, as I said, as the dawning of a new day. Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI also began to draw attention to Catholics and all persons of goodwill to issues affecting life in our earthly home. That began in 1990. So it would be completely unrealistic for me to survey all these documents. Besides, many of them say very close to the same thing again and again, having gone through them. So I will just give you a few highlights, okay? 1975, pastoral letter. This land is home to me. This is literally home to me because it's where I come from, Appalachia, okay, western Pennsylvania. It was written by 26 bishops of that region. In the 1970s, the principal industries of that area, coal mining, steel production, they were undergoing major changes. Coal extraction was shifting from deep shaft mining to strip mining, and many of the older steel mills were being closed. Written in a free verse poetic style, not often found in Catholic Church documents. This land is home to me drew attention to the connection between powerlessness and poverty in Appalachia. The bishops noted that the people who live in the hills, who love nature's freedom and beauty, who are alive with song and poetry, are also poor, among the poorest people in our nation, and suffer from oppression. To the struggle in the mountains for justice, the bishops added the struggles in industrial centers, grown gray with smoke and smog. I'm quoting them here. The problems of the mining and mill workers' communities are tied together by the Appalachian mountain chain, by the coal of the region, and in powerful words, the bishops draw attention to the absentee ownership of an industry that has scarred the land, polluted the water and air with a devastating impact on the economic and environmental health of the region. In this letter, the bishops speak, very interestingly to me, both of the dignity of people affected and also the dignity of the environment. The bishops lament, a country which took such richness from Appalachia has left so little for the people. Great fortunes were built on the exploitation of Appalachian workers and Appalachian resources. This powerful letter resonates with the lament found in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 9. Here I'll just read one verse to illustrate. Over the mountains, break out in cries of lamentation. Over the pasture lands, intone a dirge. They are scorched. No one crosses them. Unheard is the bleat of the flock, the birds of the air, as well as beasts. All have fled, and are gone. Now, in the Hebrew Scriptures, lament cries from the depths of the human spirit in times of great distress. The lament of ancient Israel is focused usually on the people's suffering due to their infidelity to the sacred covenant which God initiated. What sets Jeremiah's lament apart from many found in the Hebrew Scriptures is that it draws attention to the effects of sinful human choices on the land and the suffering of all creatures dependent on it for existence. The land is ravaged. There are people among us who are the cause. The words of Jeremiah cited above or earlier herald a contrast experience. Things ought not to be this way. Something is radically wrong. I have a sense in the sort of bland American Christianity today, we don't give sufficient attention at times to lament. It's a personal opinion. Sorry about that. The bishops close the groundbreaking document with humility and a pledge of commitment. The church continues, despite its many sins, working for the poor, insisting on practical love, and not just prayers and good intentions. Further, the bishops pledge to be with the people as they struggle to shape their own destiny, as they also seek to heal the scarred earth. The second major document came from the Midwest, 1980. Strangers and Guests Toward Community in the Heartland. The second bishop's pastoral letter, as I've already said, resulted from very close collaboration by 72 active and retired bishops of the 12 Midwestern states. This letter, released in 1980, just a few months after Pope John Paul II made his historic visit to the Diocese of Des Moines. In a homily given at the Eucharistic Liturgy on October 7th, 1979, Pope John Paul stated, "The land is God's gift entrusted to humanity from the very beginning. But the land is not only God's gift, it is also the responsibility of humans." Strangers and Guests complements John Paul II's homily. The pastoral letters begins with the bishop's invitation to be attentive to the reality of the heartland region. The earth all too frequently is being subjected to harmful farming, mining, and development practices. The opportunity of people to live a productive and rewarding life is determined largely by the relationship to the land, which should be a relationship of cooperative harmony. For the land, complemented by water and air, is our most important and limited resource. This resource should be conserved with its goods and beauty to benefit present and future generations at home and abroad. In Strangers and Guests, the Heartland bishops expressed their hope for social reforms that are necessary to preserve our land and the best of our family-oriented heritage. People who are farming the land should be able also to own it. They should do this in a way that promotes justice for all people. Among the people singled out for attention later in the document are Native Americans, whose struggle for justice is deserving of the support of the Catholic community. Apart from being the first pastoral letter on the environment to address the plight of Native Americans, this is the first time here, Midwest. Okay? Thought you'd like to know that. Among the significant elements of Strangers and Guests are 10 proposed principles offered as guidance for future decision-making and action. Since they come back from 1980, it doesn't seem apropos to go through all 10 of them. You can find them online in the internet if you want to. Just look up the document. That's where I got them. Okay. Among the 10 is a simple yet poignant statement. The land is God's, first and foremost. The land is God's. The bishops also emphasize land use planning must consider social and environmental impacts. not only prophets. These simple and straightforward principles are complemented by the bishop's emphasis on humans as God's, quote, co-creators entrusted with the responsibility to help land fulfill the purpose for which God created it, to satisfy the needs of all God's creatures. One finds further development in Catholic social thought in the impact of human choices on the environment and the Earth's ecosystems in the 1990s, due to the first United Nations sponsored conference on environment and development, also known as the First Earth Summit. It was a very exciting moment for many of us, okay, this Earth Summit. Huge amount of preparation for it. In anticipation of the 1992 Earth Summit, held in Rio de Janeiro, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in 1991 issued the document called Renewing the Earth, an invitation to reflection and action in light of Catholic social teaching. At the outset, the bishops begin with this rather terse statement. At its core, the environmental crisis is a moral challenge. It calls us to examine how we use and share the goods of the earth, what we pass on to future generations, and how we live in harmony with God's creation. In renewing the earth, the bishops give attention to aspects of the degradation of the environment and note its relationship to poverty. It is the poor and powerless who most directly bear the burden of current environmental carelessness. Now, renewing the earth calls people to conversion. We need a change of heart to preserve and protect the planet for our children and for generations yet to be born. The conversion needed is not only a moral resolve, but it is also a conversion of vision, of seeing created universe as sacramental, bringing forward that medieval notion that I already pointed out earlier with its origins in Thomas Aquinas' writings. The Christian vision of a sacramental universe, a world that discloses the Creator's presence of visible and tangible signs, can contribute to making the earth a home for the human family once again. A sacramental vision enables people to see the hand and plan of the Creator in creation. It calls them to treat other creatures and the natural world not just as means to human fulfillment, but as God's creatures possessing independent value, worthy of our respect and care. A few years later, on the 20th anniversary of This Land is Home to Me, the bishops of Appalachia issued a second pastoral, At Home in the Web of Life. In this 1995 letter, the Appalachian bishops continued the pattern of free verse used in This Land is Home to Me. They give special attention to the sacramental nature of creation by drawing, I guess I didn't move it. Okay. By drawing on the imagery of a great outdoor cathedral. They write, in this magnificent work of God's creation, misty mountain haze is holy incense. Tall tree trunks are temple pillars. Sun-splashed leaves are stained glass. And songbirds serve as angelic choirs. Such passages affirm that all creation is sacred because creation reveals the loving face of the Creator. The Appalachian bishops speak of people as the creatures made in God's image to care for our precious earth, as if earth were God's own garden, just as God cares and loves for creation. But this pastoral, for all its inspiring poetry, with its goal of lifting the spirits of people who live in the vicinity of strip mines and rusting mills, is more than that. The Appalachian bishops give attention to the many forms of environmental degradation in Appalachia, pointing to its links in economic deprivation, declaring, quotes, we do not see the crisis of nature as separate from the crisis of the poor, but both as a single crisis of community. The bishops define sustainable communities as communities where people and the rest of nature can live together in harmony and not rob future generations of life. the bishops declare that people are called to form sustainable communities and develop sustainable livelihoods, all in sacred creative communion with the land and forest and water and air, indeed with all creatures. Now, the other regional bishops' letters are certainly worthy of attention, but alas, I'm not going to go through all of them this evening. I turn now to the contributions, but I do say, if you have a chance, read the one on the Northwest Columbia watershed area by U.S. bishops with Canadian bishops. It's outstanding, but there was just too much in it to try to put it all out here this evening. It's outstanding. Anyway, peace with God, the Creator, peace with all creation. I'm going to turn now to Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI and what they offer to us on ecological justice. During Pope John Paul II's long pontificate, just about second longest in the history of Christianity, he addressed many justice-related issues. In two of his writings, he gives attention to eco-justice. The first was his 1990 World Day of Peace address entitled Peace with God, the Creator, Peace with All Creation. The second was the encyclical Centesimus Annus that he wrote to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the first social encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, which was written on the conditions of labor back in 1891. Peace with God, the Creator, peace with all creation, was given as a New Year's Day message of peace in 1990. This was 1 year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bringing to an end the Cold War, 1 year before the United States waged the Persian Gulf War. It was also 2 years prior to the United Nations Rio de Janeiro Summit on the Environment and Development, but planning was already underway. I draw attention to these simple historical events because this first ecological statement by a pope is really relevant to all those things that are going on. The Pope could see that although communism in Eastern Europe had collapsed, utopia was not following. The world was still haunted by the specter of violence, growing poverty, and expanding ecological crisis. The Pope emphasized that commitment to Christ calls one to a path of global responsibility and solidarity, a theme at the heart of Pope John Paul II's leadership with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, as you know anything about history, you know that behind the scenes, especially through Poland and neighboring countries, he was very active in that breakup. He urged all people to resolve to defend human life and to care for God's creation. In the statement's opening, John Paul II connects the issue of world peace to the related issues of health of the planet and the flourishing of humans. He writes, and here I'll quote him just very briefly, "In our day, there is a growing awareness that world peace is threatened not only by the arms race, regional conflicts, and continued injustices among people and nations, but also by a lack of, quotes, underlined, due respect for nature, by the plundering of natural resources, and by a progressive decline in the quality of life around the world." So the Pope will call for a Christian response for peacemaking with nature. So later in the statement, John Paul II pointedly stressed that no peaceful society can afford to neglect either respect for life or the fact that there is an integrity to creation. He also called for carefully coordinated solutions to human and ecological problems based on a morally coherent worldview. He stressed that peace demands of humans a particular responsibility for all of creation. And this particular responsibility called for, again and again in this short passage, is solidarity. Solidarity among peoples expressed in a covenant of global cooperation, a cooperation that will lead to the building of peace among nations and the care of creation. But the hopefulness of the Pope's statement, after all, it's New Year's Day, when he's giving it, beginning of a new year, be happy, be hopeful, is also balanced by a realistic reminder. Today, any form of war could lead to incalculable ecological damage. But even local or regional wars, however limited, not only destroy human life and social structures, they also damage the land, they ruin the crops, they kill the vegetation, because they poison the soil and water. Survivors of war are forced to begin a new life in a very difficult, depleted environmental condition, which in turn creates situations of extreme social unrest with further negative consequences for the environment. Very strong statement. One that, when I read it, I just kept holding on to it for years. I went back to it for this talk. A year later, in his encyclical, marking the 100th anniversary of the first, John Paul II again made reference to negative military impacts on people and the environment. In Santissimus Annus, he also calls for disarming huge military machines so that the resources invested in arms could be used by the wealthier nations to assist the less developed ones, that they may have sustainable life. Pope John Paul II's encyclical was released shortly after the end of the Persian Gulf War. One might argue that often the cost of human casualties in war is soon forgotten. I mean, how many people died in the Iraqi war that began in 2003? Can anybody tell me? How many? A couple thousand. I looked, and the more conservative numbers that I could find so far among Iraqis was 96, almost 97,000 people. The upper level was 100,000. Sorry about that. Yeah, troops are different. But the other part, though, of this is that no one, or rarely does anyone, I shouldn't say no one, that's a very big generalized statement, but rarely do people pay attention to the collateral damage to the environment by war, the damage to the natural resources. They're not given much attention. Data gathered by the United Nations Environmental Program in Iraq after the Persian Gulf War, which was rather short, like something like 105 days, took note of the destruction of human settlements due to U.S. bombing, and also the contamination of the land, air, and water. The NEP took note also of bombs containing depleted uranium that were dropped by the United States, causing radioactive contamination that would affect the people's water for a long time to come. Also, they pointed to pollution from bombed and sabotaged oil wells. Both were judged to result in long-term negative impact on the soil and the water supplies, especially the wells upon which the people and their livestock depend. The World Health Organization also went in and focused on the long-term effects of bombs with warheads containing depleted uranium. That's uranium U-238 rather than 235, okay? And noting their potential to generate significant medical consequences, especially cancer in children, okay? Leukemia was growing in certain pockets of the population among children. Now, in spring 2003, the United States again attacked Iraq and engaged in an intense bombing offensive known as shock and awe. Some of the warheads contained, once again, depleted uranium. The shock and awe bombing of Iraqi cities was of a larger scale than in 1991, killing at least 6,600 people within a few weeks. The spillage and burning of oil was also greater, producing toxic clouds that blocked the sun and circled Iraq and its neighboring countries for months on end. The United Nations has not yet been able to get in there to do a full assessment of the environmental damage of this war, but they are predicting that it's going to have extreme long-term impact on Iraq's population and fragile ecosystems that will be greater than in the 1991 war. Oh, there it is. The war in Iraq and the specter of warfare underscore Pope John Paul II's call for a covenant of global cooperation and the building of peace among nations, a peace that would also embrace the care of creation. I turn now to the most recent encyclical, Benedict XVI and his treatment of ecology. In June 2009, it was actually the 29th, Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, Benedict released the first social encyclical that gives substantive attention to environmental concerns. This is of a whole other level within Catholic speak than just a peace statement on the first of the year, which largely people don't pay much attention to. The title of the encyclical is Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth. Less than 6 months later, he continued his focus on ecology in his own World Day of Peace message entitled, If You Want to Cultivate Peace, Protect Creation. We'll look at both of these somewhat briefly. I will begin with Caritas in Veritate, in which Pope Benedict XVI addresses the complicated economic realities of globalization and development. This letter was actually supposed to come out 2 years earlier. But when the financial picture of the globe tanked, he had to go back and rewrite it. He stresses that globalization is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. Therefore, we should not be its victims, but rather its protagonists, acting in the light of reason, guided by charity and truth, to correct the malfunctions, some of them serious, that cause divisions between peoples and depletions of the earth. In company with globalization, Benedict speaks of human development, drawing attention to the relationship of human and environmental ecologies. The theme of development is not new in Catholic social teaching. First was addressed in 1967 by Pope Paul VI, shortly after the Second Vatican Council. I thought it was a wonderful document, but since it came so soon after that council, nobody paid much attention to it. But Benedict not only affirms what many of the things that Pope Paul VI had said, he goes further. He says, there is clear proof today of the pernicious effects of sin, especially of greed in economic life. Providing an adequate overview of this 54-page encyclical with its 107 footnotes provides a huge challenge for anyone, especially humble me. So at the risk of oversimplification, I will set the context for presenting Pope Benedict's treatment of eco-justice by providing a kind of summary overview in 4 points for the whole encyclical. This may be a flawed analysis, but it gives you a context. First, Pope Benedict calls for human development to be seen as a vocation, guided by moral economic principles. Vocation, something that comes from God. Second, in keeping with the Catholic social tradition, Benedict calls for individuals and institutions to move beyond political partisanship of right versus left, to place poor people at the center of their concern. Third, the encyclical challenges investors and consumers, business and labor, public officials and financiers to avoid the pursuit of narrow, short-term economic interests and instead to pursue the common good in all our economic choices. Finally, he points to badly managed and largely speculative financial dealing, large-scale migration of people trying to survive, and unregulated exploitation of the Earth's resources, as posing problems that demand the global community's attention. At the core of the encyclical is the connection Pope Benedict makes between the duty to live in accord with the demands of charity in a very complex, globalized world, and to anchor this love in the truth about the human person and the ethical requirements of economic life today. He insists charity begins with justice. Charity begins with justice. If we love others with charity, then first of all, we are just towards them. Not only is justice not extraneous to charity, not only is it not an alternative or parallel path to charity, justice is inseparable from charity and intrinsic to it. He makes a similar connection between charity and the common good. The more we strive to secure a common good corresponding to the real needs of our neighbors, the more effectively we will love them. The practice of charity requires more of us than concern for our immediate neighbors. Charity has an institutional path. We might also call it a political path, which is no less excellent and effective than the kind of charity which encounters the neighbor directly. At its core, Benedict's encyclical is concerned with the moral dimension of economic life today and all that involves in 54 pages, as I said, single-spaced. The economy needs ethics in order to function correctly. Not any ethics whatsoever, but ethics which is people-centered rather than profit-centered. The Pope insists justice must be applied to every phase of economic activity, whether it involves locating resources, financing production, consumption, and all other phases of economic life. For a more just world to become reality today, Benedict calls for personal conversion, moral discernment, and ethical action by individuals as the foundation for structural steps needed to create a more just economy that is attuned to the requirements of the common good. For the sweeping reforms needed in today's globalized world to be enacted, he argues, there is urgent need of true world political authority, one established to manage the global economy, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security, and peace, and yes, to regulate migration and to guarantee the protection of the environment. A groundbreaking element of the encyclical is his extended treatment, chapter 4 of the encyclical, on the state of ecological health and the moral dimensions of environment. Pope Benedict declares, the environment is God's gift to everyone. Now, we've heard this before from the Midwest bishops, okay? The land is a gift to everyone. And in our use of it, we have a responsibility towards the poor, towards future generations, and towards humanity as a whole. He calls for intergenerational justice, responsible stewardship of nature, in order to protect it, to enjoy its fruits, and to cultivate it in new ways, including restraining consumption, developing renewable energy technology, and helping the poorest people and countries to deal with their complex environmental challenges. Pope Benedict, like popes before him, unambiguously supports public initiatives to resolve our current environmental challenges. He says, the protection of the environment, of resources, and of climate to be in the hands of international leaders who would act jointly and to show readiness to work in good faith, respecting the law and promoting solidarity with the weakest regions of the planet. He was anticipating the Copenhagen Conference. This is an imperative because every violation of solidarity and civic friendship harms the environment, just as environmental deterioration in turn upsets relations in society. Nature, especially in our time, is so integrated into the dynamics of society and culture that by now it hardly constitutes an independent variable. The Pope continues, desertification, decline in productivity in some agricultural areas, are also the result of impoverishment, underdevelopment among the inhabitants. When incentives are offered for their economic and cultural development, nature itself will be protected. Peaceful agreements about the use of resources can protect nature and at the same time the well-being of the societies concerned. Now, Pope Benedict's statements reflect a distinctively organic view of society that calls for true cooperation and not merely compromise guided by self-interest. The word common good is a repetitious mantra almost within this document. Now, an indication of that Pope Benedict wants to make teachings on the environment a major contribution of his pontificate is signaled on the 1st of January 2010 in his own peace message. If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation. His purpose here is to provide further development to his treatment of ecology and charity and truth. Maybe he thought this would be after the Copenhagen meeting and this would be something to celebrate. I will only just cite one small thing from the final paragraph. He writes, "The quest for peace of people of goodwill surely become easier if all acknowledge that the indivisible relationship between God, human beings, and the whole of creation, Christ crucified and risen, has bestowed his spirit of holiness upon humankind to guide the course of history in anticipation of that day when, with the glorious return of the Savior, there will be a new heaven and a new earth in which justice and peace will dwell forever. Protecting the natural environment in order to build a world of peace is a duty incumbent upon each and all of us." Conclusions, everybody's favorite part of a talk, including my own. This sort of like flurry here, conclusion. I have drawn attention to the undeniable side of our time. Creation is groaning in the midst of escalating climate change and global warming. Lynn White was right to draw attention to anthropocentrism as the enemy of a healthy planet, even though his decision to lay blame at the feet of medieval Christianity strikes me as rather flawed. The better locus of the problem, as I've already noted, would be Francis Bacon and his rhetorical strategy to push forward scientific progress. As a point of contrast, I have argued that the Genesis creation texts are open to an ecological interpretation that draws attention to the fact that the directive given to humans to exercise dominion has nothing to do with domination and conquest in a way in which earth is damaged. The texts instead call for tilling the earth as a service and remind us of our creaturely kinship with other animals. Although Pope John Paul II did not use the term creaturely kinship in his 1990 World Day of Peace message, he did call for an active solidarity with our human sisters and brothers and for respect for all creatures. Solidarity among humans in the struggle for justice and peace has long been one of the fundamental principles of Catholic social thought. And I believe that the solidarity needed in 2010 must extend beyond human relationship to Earth's other species because all are part of God's creation. Solidarity as an eco-justice principle requires the humble awareness brought to our attention by biological evolution and by the scriptures themselves that, like the rest of Earth's creatures, we are made of many of the same elements and share a common biological ancestry. A solidarity relationship to all other creatures of Earth acknowledges our mutual connectedness and interdependence. Further, it is a call to be of service to the Earth and its fragile ecosystems. In the call to solidarity, Pope Benedict XVI adds emphasis to the call, adds emphasis on the common good. The common good has been traditionally described in Catholic moral theology as, quotes, this is from the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching, by the way, as a sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. In Charity and Truth, Pope Benedict gives considerable attention to his principle and makes some overtures to extending it to the whole earth community. This extension resonates with a fundamental Catholic belief in the sacramentality of all creation. Commitment to solidarity with humans and Earth's other kind, and to all-encompassing global common good, although desperately needed today, admittedly will be very difficult to attain. Sacrifice is a hard sell, especially for Americans. Living simply so that others can simply live goes against the grain of many people in America. It's sort of like anti-American psyche. Live simply so that others can live. First attributed to a Catholic woman by the name of Elizabeth Ann Seton. It challenges us to reconceive our place on the planet and to be attuned to the many overt and subtle forms of violence we direct to it. The call for such a reception is not new. 60 years ago, Albert Einstein stressed, "Our task must be to free ourselves from the prison of self-interest by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." This is a direction into which Catholic social teachings on ecology, I think, are moving. To become this free of self-interest, to become this free will require Homo sapiens, who make up actually only 1% of Earth's living species, to surrender an anthropocentric, human-centered view of the world in order to require a more biocentric one, and to enact major steps to counter economic self-interest for the sake of global sustainability. The temptation to despair of ever achieving this is great, but yielding to this temptation is also a failure of moral imagination and could be as well an affront to God if God plays a role in your life. Mindfulness of the sacramentality of nature and the recognition of our creaturely kinship with other species surely can help to inspire us to free ourselves from the prison of self-interest. But the practice of eco-justice also requires an accompanying moral resolve to enter into a right relationship with Earth and its creatures. Many of our choices have been at the level of plundering the Earth in the name of conquest and human progress, but with disastrous outcomes. But just as human ingenuity can be used to create life-saving medicines and products that have greatly enhanced human survival, so too do we have the God-given creativity and intelligence to bring the restorative earth healing needed to sustain life on our planet. I believe it's really in us. We just have to get it out there more. Many people, including faculty and students at Iowa State, are engaged in this work already, but clearly much more remains to be done. Surely now is the time to make every day Earth Day by widening our circle of compassion to encompass the earth and its many forms of life. Thank you for your kind attention. And I think it's faulty, very myopic reasoning. So. Yes.
The Catholic view of sacramentality
Yeah, put it very, yes, yes.
Those are characteristic Catholic notions.
Yes. They're found in other religions too, but yeah, we don't need to go into all that right now. Yeah, right, yeah.
Well, I really believe with my heart that solidarity is necessary. What kind of dialogue is possible theologically with our Protestant brothers and sisters in relation to the environment? What points do we share? And I'm saying,
Well,
we
it,
share the same notion
well, it, right.
or the same notion of God speaking through nature.
But because of ecumenism since the 1960s, I have been in conversation with many Protestant theologian types who are discovering sacramentality. So, you have a Sally McFaig, who's a Methodist by background, who writes extensively on that and wants to talk with Catholics about it, So this is happening. It's certainly present in the Episcopal Church and in the Eastern Orthodox churches. So, I mean, people are coming to grips with it. Well, that's another issue. That's a little bit harder one. Their stance. However, some fundamentalists, evangelical Protestants, are very strongly committed to stewardship. So it's coming from a different impulse. But it's happening. World Council of Churches has done stuff with this. Part of the problem is, often it's been said of, Catholic social teaching, it's the church's best kept secret. We can't seem to get this kind of stuff out there. We don't have a good way of communicating. We communicate stuff that just isn't as central as this or as interesting or important from my standpoint. Anyway. So any of the students in my courses who have sat through all this time, duly noted when comes time to be looking at grades, of course. And if you have any thoughts you want to lift up. Yes. Mm-hmm. Dominion, yeah, it's sort of like we get this notion of dominion, but it's more like medieval rule. It's not really part of what the scriptures were about. I did do some of that research. It's pretty detailed. If you want to send me an email, I'll give you some of that. But it's not, you think about people, maybe 500s BC or earlier, writing these texts. What is their notion of dominating it, the earth? It's getting the rocks out of the way so we can get our little plow down and get a few, grains in there that might sprout. You have to look, for me, I have to look at the world context of these things. And we take them out of context and we make them into something different in a different time frame. And I'm thinking, no, first of all, look at what they were about then. They had no clue about dominating anything. They were just trying to survive. Especially if the text was in fact written post-exile and they're coming back to reclaim poor Israel that had fallen apart while they were away, Anyway, thank you, though, for the good question. I do have some more research on that. Did you have a question, Kevin?
One of the important drivers for environmental problems is population growth.
Right.
And, of course, church teachings historically has been dissuade birth control.
Right.
And I wanted to know whether there's been any movement on this, given, any recognition that it's going to be a much harder challenge to move toward global sustainability without some kind of implementation of birth control technologies widely available in developing countries everywhere. Otherwise, it's hard to know how that goal can be achieved.
Right. And fact of the matter is, this does not feature in the writing as sort of like a moral choice, as you already highlighted. The take on it is it's more of a problem of distribution than a population growth. So that this is questionable, you've already raised the question. I mean, I can't make something into what doesn't exist, so I think that's pretty true to the position. So it doesn't feature in these writings in any kind of direct moral sense. It's not saying that it's sort of like immoral. I mean, you will never expect, I think, any religious group to say it's immoral to have more than so many children. They're just not going to do that. Yes, Aladdin. Yes. Yes. Oh, that makes sense. But I mean, I understand the question, because the first time I ever gave a paper on ecological theology at a conference, that comment that came from the back of the room was raised as a question. Why should we care about this? What we're about is going to heaven. And what really matters is how we take care of our neighbors. So, yes, it could be. Oh, I think maybe some people have thought about it, but you expressed it very well.
I'm sure someone has, but my question really is asking, like, should they consider that factor? Like, maybe that will happen, maybe we should avoid dying off before Jesus comes to save us?
I think you should spread that word, Aladdin. That would be helpful. That'd be helpful to Christians, okay? As an outsider looking in, that should be helpful for you to do. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.